Hey, Nightmare Success listeners, we are back, and man, am I excited about this guest because sometimes you read stuff and you think, man, I wish I could interview that guy. Well, Michael Morosky, I've got to big shout out to him. He was a guest on the show probably 3 or 4 episodes ago, and we were talking a couple Saturdays ago, and said, hey, Brent, you ought to read up on Jeff Grant, and he gave me place to go look for him. And then he gave me his contact information. And I was reading his New Yorker article. And I was like, my gosh, I've got to talk to this guy. Um, what he's been able to do and what his story is should probably be a book and a movie. But give you a little bit of background about Jeff Grant. He was a very successful real estate attorney in New York, and he had I think it was a sport injury, and I've out of the different articles, I think it was like an Achilles tendon tear, but he got addicted to prescription opioids, and that ran him into things that he probably wouldn't have done in his life. But he kind of went on to live in the wild side there in the markets and everything else. But he ended up serving 14 months in federal prison for a white collar crime. It was a small business loan fraud that he committed in 2001, and then just started his own reentry, earning a Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, majoring in social ethics. After graduating from Divinity School, Jeff was called to serve as inner city church in Bridgeport, Connecticut, as an associate minister, director of prison ministries. Then he co-founded Progressive Prison Ministries, and it's the first of its kind. It's a ministry dedicated to serving people navigating the white-collar criminal justice system. And he has a support group for white-collar people that are going through the nightmare of their life. And I was lucky enough to be a part of that last night. It's a Monday night Zoom call, and it's just fantastic. It's Jeff and I were just talking before this started. It's a one of its kind. You feel, the empathy and the help and the support that you're looking for, and it's just fantastic that Jeff is using his journey of his experiences and being able to help people out. And we had some people that were on for that'd been out for 12 years, and we had somebody that was speaking that had been out for 6 weeks or 6 months. It was just a great combination of a great group. So before we get into all that, I want to welcome our sponsor in, who is Auto Plaza Direct. Who likes spending a couple of weekends walking car lots looking for a car? Then you spend like 4 to 5 hours in the dealership to buy a car. It's kind of like going to a trip to the dentist. Well, there's a better way. Take away all that pain and hassle of getting a car. It's called Auto Plaza Direct. They are your personal car concierge. Just tell them the car you want, what you can pay, and they'll go find that car for you. They'll negotiate your best price, and they'll deliver that car to you. They also offer warranties and financing, full service. Go to autoplazadirect.com to get started with your personal car concierge. The new hassle-free way, the car buying experience you deserve. Auto Plaza Direct. Tell them Brent from Nightmare Success sent you. And I had a great experience. I thought I was down and done with getting my truck, and Don Davis figured out a way to get the deal done. So I am a personal client that appreciates the help of Auto Plaza Direct. So everybody, Jeff Grant, welcome in. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Brent. I'm having been with you last night on Zoom and having you attend the White Collar Support Group meeting, it just feels like just a continuation of that conversation. So I'm really happy about it.
Well, I love it. I'm glad you made the time. I know you're a busy man, and you're doing and you just moved, and so I think everything you do is like, I get this action feel from you. You don't sit around and wait on things. I was curious reading through all the stuff, Jeff, that you've gone through and the different steps you took both before you had your nightmare happen to you and after. Growing up as a kid, what was that like? I mean, were you the same kind? What What was happening in your world as a kid?
I think of all the interviews I've ever done, you're the first one who's wanted to go all the way back to like the childhood trauma stuff. And actually, to me, it's really an interesting story, although it's not really my story as much as it is a cultural story.
Yeah.
Because I was a kid, I grew up on the South Shore of Long Island. And I was part of this kind of exodus out of Brooklyn that Jews did back then in the late 50s, early 60s. And our parents were all kind of the same in a way. You know, they were in a strange way. They weren't Holocaust deniers. It just never got discussed. You know, I was only born 9 years after the end of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
All of that was never discussed with us at all. It was as if
That's interesting that it wasn't. Do
No,
you think there was a reason? What it was? Was it a direct, decision that that's just not something that we're going to go down that path?
I think that for cultural Jews, really or Jews who had limited observance,
Mm-hmm.
which was most of kind of what Long Island was. It was really about a new lifestyle. It was the swinging 60s. My parents were kind of like my father was like Matt Helm.
Yeah.
And my mother was like, my mother looked exactly like Connie Stevens, beautiful, beautiful woman.
Yeah.
And they just wanted to put whatever that whole lifestyle behind them. And so we all moved en masse to these newly created towns out in Long Island that were kind of dredged up, literally from the Great South Bay and the East Bay. And we were the first people who lived there. I mean, there were sand dunes, and the houses were going up like dinosaurs, rising from the sand. And we grew up pretty much without parents. We grew up, our parents did not raise us.
You were out and about.
And we were
with your friends.
Right, with our friends. And, and it was in some ways it was a simpler world, kind of ride bikes, you leave in the morning and you come home late at night. But on the other hand, without parental supervision, we really had to figure out our own ethics and what our own right and wrong was. And then when we got to be about 13 years old, we found our parents' liquor cabinets. And I remember with my friends in Merrick, Long Island, which is where I grew up, we would find a vodka bottle in one of our parents' liquor cabinets. And then like 5 of us would ride our bikes up to the Dairy Barn store, which was a double drive-through deli, which was Dairy Barn was all over Long Island. And we would get 5 or 6 containers of Tropicana orange juice and then drive mix it all up into screwdrivers and then sit on the basketball court at dusk and get drunk.
Yeah.
I tell this story to almost anybody who grew up in Long Island and maybe any suburb, I don't know.
Yeah.
But everybody relates right away, like, of course. And this is kind of what it was. It was a ethically challenged time in a lot of ways, where the people who were kind of most fortunate had a more solid family structure.
Yeah.
I wasn't like that. Most of my friends weren't. And I kind of rode the line between being in the AP classes with the smart kids. Yeah. But I was a cool kid hanging out in the parking lot with my friends.
Do you have siblings, Jeff?
I do. I have a younger brother and a younger sister.
So you were the oldest out of the bunch of all this that was going on at that time. Yeah.
I was the oldest. And so there's just a lot of, throughout the whole area, my whole upbringing, a lot of drinking and drug abuse and mental illness and all kinds of things like that. And it manifested in different families in different ways. But mine ultimately was, just a path that I didn't really ever expect to get free from. I don't know that I've gotten free from it now. I really don't.
Well, I mean, it's kind of interesting, though. I mean, you bring that up, and it kind of sounds like a free-flowing society, basically. And then you end up being this kid that gets into, law school and law. And how did all that? How did you take those steps out from where you were?
I really didn't know any other way. I mean, there was never really anything else I considered. I went to college, partied my way through college.
Most people do, yeah.
Right. Had an awakening at some point in college that I better do well enough. And I knew I wanted to go to law school, although I don't know that it was for any reason other than having watched Judd for the Defense on TV.
Right.
And but I did go straight into law school, and my drinking and drug abuse never, I mean, it abated. I mean, it didn't kind of get in the way of what I wanted to accomplish, but it certainly, there were consequences all along the way that had I been more aware of, I probably could have taken more remedial action. Jobs I lost and relationships that I lost.
Did you recognize it, Jeff, at that time? Because you talk about it, and that it was kind of always around, and then you had the, later on had the opioid addiction deal. Was it just kind of always in your orbit?
Yeah, I think so. In varying degrees. I mean, I certainly for most of my friends, say from high school and college, they stopped partying before I did.
Yeah.
And then I would kind of drink or drug in isolation. It wasn't a social thing so much anymore. But
because you were kind of in a social world of, going from, college to law school, to being an attorney and having, those after hour drinks and clients and all that kind of stuff. You were around it. I mean, there was no escaping the environment.
Yeah, it was all part of that. I mean, before I tore my Achilles tendon and had the surgery.
So I was right about that.
Oh, you were right. You were definitely right. You're 100% right. But before that happened in 1992, I had been pretty sober for a pretty extended period. I wouldn't say I was a saint, but I certainly understood that I had to kind of like, I had to get my shit together, and I did, and the positive consequences was that I was able to move my law firm from New York up to Westchester, where we had moved at that point we had moved to Rye, and I was raising, we were raising our children there. And so I was a more attentive dad. I was able to go to, the school plays and whatever there was. But in 92, when I had ruptured the Achilles tendon, I went down on the basketball court and called an orthopedist friend who was at the local hospital in Portchester, I think. And I told him that he couldn't touch me unless he gave me a script of 40 Demerol. And I have no idea where that came from. That wasn't, there was no fluidity between the life I was living in the few years before that and that. It was like automatic. The rules are suspended. Now I can do this. This is what I want. Yep. Yeah. And he did.
And I think, let's go back a little bit, because at that time, you had, on your business world, tremendous success. I mean, you were a guy in demand attorney that took no prisoners, and There was the competitive game that you were winning in an arena that is very, it's like gladiator school where you were in New York and Manhattan and real estate and that. Was that itself intoxicating for you?
Oh, sure. I mean, it was a, I'd later been diagnosed with, bipolar disorder, and I understood that I was self-medicating through a
Yeah.
lot of that.
Yeah.
But all of that, that go real estate and syndication work and
Yeah.
all that I was doing, um, it was great for my disposition and great for my intellect, excuse me. But probably the worst thing that I could have done for my bipolar disorder,
Sure.
because it was just, it was so late nights and stress and irregular, and I didn't really realize how much it was eroding my my ability just to live kind of a normal life.
Mm-hmm.
And as the firm grew, and
Because you
and
had like 20 plus people as attorneys in there, right? It was a
I had 20 employees of my own, but I was
Yeah.
also general counsel to a couple of large real estate companies, outside general counsel.
Yeah.
So I was managing their lawyering, and they had lawyers for everything. They had tax lawyers and
Mm-hmm.
or tenant lawyers, and so I was the paymaster. All the bills came to me, and I was a real dyed-in-the-wool general counsel, which I amazingly I am again.
Yeah.
But um, I I loved it. I loved being right at the center, and kind of being the consigliere to really wealthy people and their families. Wealthy real estate families who
Yeah.
they were living on the edge too. I mean, they were.
Sure. I think that's what's fascinating though. You were in that world with people who were making things happen. You were making things happen. Uh, I guess that's also when, the fall is so much more dramatic, I think, a lot of times for people who had all that going on in their world, and then all of a sudden you are in this, spiral of, I always say that my experience is when I started going through it, it felt like I was falling into a deep hole, and I thought I could grab the edges, and the edges just kept moving out further and further. I just kept falling further down. And when this happened for you with the injury, and you had all this other stuff going on in your world, uh, kids, wife,
Mhm.
business, uh, being in the world of the arena you wanted to be in. Um, when you started sliding down that Demerol path, did it feel like you were on a slide, or did you just think I'm coping?
Um, I definitely knew that this was maladaptive behavior. There's no doubt
Yeah.
about it. But I didn't care.
Yeah.
And the benchmarks, the objective benchmarks were all clear.
Mm-hmm.
And but I wanted my fix. And as my drug of choice kind of shifted from Demerol to OxyContin, and I was an early victim of the opioid crisis. Although I take care not to ever really characterize myself as a victim, but certainly if you look at the availability and the doctors who were writing, and it's hard to divorce myself from that narrative. I've watched documentaries, and I've watched
It's been a lot on it. That's
a
for
lot
sure.
on it. And it's clear that I was caught up in the midst of it, and there was no way out. I mean, because even back then there was no, there were very few resources for people who were going through that. They didn't recognize it, at the scale that we've come to recognize it since. But there was a tipping point at some point where things were not getting better; they were getting worse. And I didn't, and the physical manifestations were huge. I mean, I'd blown up to 285 pounds.
Mm.
I looked like a guy who had a drug addiction, my pallor, I was erratic.
Did your kids or wife think that anything, or they sit you down and say, "Hey, Dad or husband, what's going on?"
No,
No.
and I don't blame them for that.
No, no, I'm not saying that it was any blame. I'm just
Yeah, no,
walking around in that world. You might not even notice it as much because
no.
you're around it all the time.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking now, that nobody, well, actually, here's what happened. So, just to like jump ahead and then we can kind of get back.
Sure.
When I finally went to rehab and I was sitting in, I was in, I think still on 15 or 30-minute checks. So, you're in checks in these places so that you don't kill yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And or at least so they're not liable if you kill yourself.
Yeah.
Our best friends came to visit from New Jersey, and I was in New Canaan, Connecticut at Silver Hill at the time, and I was crying. My whole life had just come tumbling down, and I said to them, I don't understand. We've been best friends for 20 years. Why didn't you ever tell me that you saw me, doing all this? You saw me sliding down.
Mm-hmm.
And they looked at me and they said, Jeffrey, we must have told you 100 times.
Mm-hmm.
And I never heard one of them.
Probably didn't want to hear it. I
did not want to hear it. And
Yeah.
I don't recall, to this day, I don't recall once, but they were adamant. So,
Yes.
it's hard to know what's real or what's revisionist.
Sure. I'm sure some of it's very blurry.
Yeah.
But I'm curious though, Jeff, how did you arrive there? Because rehab has so many different paths, and
Well,
I think the interesting part of your story is you end up there and get sober, and then all the bricks fall on you on the criminal side. It had to be, it was like a 1-2 step punch almost.
Well, what had happened was that the day came that I couldn't make my payroll anymore, and which should not have come as a surprise, but of course I was not paying attention at all. And I instructed my office manager to borrow money from the client escrow fund. Mm-hmm. And which was insane because that's the end of the ride.
Yeah, that's a nuclear button push, right?
Right. But I wasn't. I just wasn't sober enough to realize that, and I did it, and did it a few other times, and the investigation started not long thereafter. And I defended myself, hired an ethics lawyer, and that kind of like was sliding downward, even as my use of OxyContin was increasing. Mm. And then 9/11 came, and that rocked me, probably because I knew that I was already bottoming out, and yeah. it felt like the end of the world. It felt like the end of the world for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But
all in one fell swoop of one day. Yeah.
So about 2 months later, the SBA was advertising disaster loans for businesses that had been directly affected by 9/11. And my business in Westchester County was in one of the counties that was directly abutting New York City. So my business was in the zone where I could have been approved. I called them up. In fact, they told me that they would approve me. It was pretty easy to get the money. Despite the fact that they told me that they would approve me, in filling out the actual application, I lied and said I had an office that was about a block from Ground Zero. But
I did read that you were borrowing a conference room there, so there was some kind of maybe way that you played that in your mind.
I think the real point there was that, one, yes, I had conference facilities at that location, and it was on my letterhead as my
Yeah.
Manhattan office. But I
Yeah.
had never, it was relatively new that in that location, and I had never used it. So there was no economic impact whatsoever on me or my firm, the fact that we were unable to use that location.
Right. Right.
But you can just see that the rationale was
At that time
rationalization was
period.
there.
Yeah.
And I really did think it was the end of the world.
Mhm.
And so they did fund me $247,000. So the wire fraud portion of it was the lie. The money laundering portion of it was that I had put a lot of the expenses for the firm on my personal credit cards at that point. And when the money came in, when I tell you in a fit of mania, I went literally to each bank and paid off those credit cards the day the money cleared. It was as if I couldn't stop myself. And I knew better. I understood what that money was for operating and not for payment of antecedent debt. But I did things I never would have let a client do.
Yeah.
And I was crazy. So I did it. And so taking the money from operating and transferring it to myself and paying my personal credit cards, that was fundamentally the money laundering. So not long thereafter, the ethics case, the grievance case, had progressed to the point where it was clear I was going to lose my law license. And I called my ethics lawyer, and he told me the jig was up. That was it. And I told him, please call them up, tell them I'm resigning my law license today. And then I went to one of my doctors. I got one last prescription, filled it. And after my family went to sleep that night, I took the entire bottle of pills and I tried to kill myself.
Intending to kill yourself.
I tried.
You know, that kind of stuff brings hair up on my arms because, you know, hitting rock bottom like that is a moment where people either stay and get worse, or it's a new beginning of how do I climb out. And from your story, I mean, it's obvious that what happens after that, but it's because I had that too. I had a rock bottom moment where, and my thought too was I had a where it really, you know, it was the night before I was going down to do the plea, and my problem was, Jeff, is I had never thought about what, because we'd been fighting the whole fight. You go to bed with it, wake up with it. I never thought, wait a minute, I'm going to go to prison. How do I do that? And how do I live the rest of my life as an ex-felon? And I, started feeling bad for myself. But I caught myself, in the fact that, wow, this would be the worst way that I could ever be seen by my kids and my wife. And, I'm a glass half full guy. And it was, I remember the moment so vividly. And I know by kind of reading through your story, that had to have been a moment for you of what happened.
Well, I think at that point I was way more of a coward than you were. But it didn't even really feel that rational, because I was stoned, I wanted to be stoned, and I mean, the concept of killing myself at that point, I probably, my guess is over the course of my life at that point, I think I was 45 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I probably subconsciously tried to kill myself 100 times.
Sure.
Just how close to the edge can I get?
Mm-hmm.
And in all kinds of different ways.
Yeah, playing in the gray area is playing with that. Yeah.
So over the next few days, I detoxed myself. Again, that wasn't a strain, although this was more drugs than I'd ever taken. I detoxed myself hundreds of times, like every weekend. I promised myself I'd never do it again. I'd go through the sweats, I'd go through whatever.
Yeah.
during that whole 10 years. And then 2 days later, I have to go get more.
Right.
So I detoxed over the next couple of days, and then called up Silver Hill, and they had a bed for me after a couple of days. And I went there, and it was really a life-altering experience. Not only was it the first time that I was going to be put on proper bipolar meds,
Mm-hmm.
but
Is that at that time, were you even diagnosed that as being bipolar?
I don't think so.
Yeah. So you didn't
Not-
even know.
No, not formally. I mean, I may have
Right.
suspected it on some level, and
Sure.
certainly the people who worked for me suspected it, because
Yeah.
they knew I was on a roller coaster every day.
Yeah.
But it was it was kind of the shift from a transactional way of life to a transformative way of life.
Mm,
Because I
a
didn't have a
good
career.
statement.
Yeah, I didn't have a career anymore. I
Mhm.
didn't. We were going to have to sell our home.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know what kind of assets I would have. I didn't know anything. But I threw myself into recovery heavily.
Mm-hmm.
After 7 weeks at Silver Hill, I attended my first AA meeting, and I started going to like 3 AA meetings a day. Pretty soon thereafter, we had to move. We had to sell the house, and I moved. Our family moved from Rye, which is a beautiful
Mm-hmm.
community, but we moved 6 miles away to Greenwich, Connecticut,
Mm-hmm.
which is, of course, where everybody who loses their job and has no money moves to, is Greenwich, Connecticut. But that's where my AA meetings were. And
What did
so,
that feel like for you, the family, making that move?
really frightening. I didn't know if I could pay the rent.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know anything. We drove around, and it was kind of a worst case scenario, best case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And we wound up somewhere in the middle. Things were not good with, probably needless to say, things were not good with my now ex-wife.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure felt betrayed and didn't understand.
Right.
My kids were frightened. And I wasn't really thinking about them too much. I was working on my own recovery.
Being sober.
Yep.
Yeah.
And what I was told in AA was, put the oxygen mask on yourself first.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize how that meant I was going to have to abandon my family for a while,
Mm-hmm.
in order to work on myself sufficiently so that I could be there. And I did that. And I took the AA, I hate to sound too cliche, but duck to water.
Mm-hmm.
I threw myself in. And part of it was just because I had nowhere else to go.
Right. And that was
But
a big support system for you. Yeah.
Yeah. But also it was resonating with me, and
Sure.
there was something authentic there, that spiritually authentic, that I knew I felt when I was young, when I was 12 years old or so, but in the intervening 30 some odd years had somehow been corrupted by family and life and career.
Yeah.
And now I was kind of like back in a place where I felt seen, or at least I felt welcome.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, because I was able to get into the RDAP program, get a year off, and that's the reason why I wanted in, was because you get a year off. But it's rational behavioral therapy, and I was going in thinking that's all good and everything, but I'm wanting my year off, and I really started understanding that there's a lot to, if you really get deep into those type of things, understanding. And I almost think that, not almost think, I think that something like that should be taught in middle school, high schools, for kids to be able to understand what they're doing, how they're doing it, why they're doing it. But I got a lot more out of it than I certainly thought I would when I got in, for sure.
Yeah. So I was literally going to AA meetings 3 times a day and not going home in between. Those were my instructions by my sponsor. Don't go home is death. Don't go home. Don't get into the covers. And after about 20 months of sobriety, I got a call from a federal agent, 2 of them actually, on the phone with me, who told me there was a warrant out for my arrest in connection with the SBA loan and my fraudulent statements. And this was now still in the bubble around 9/11. And they gave me 2 weeks to turn myself in, and I hired a lawyer. And I went down to 500 Pearl Street, which was in downtown Manhattan. And it was like a war zone down there, still with checkpoints and military and I really did feel like the worst person in the world. It was terrible. But I turned myself into with my lawyer's assistance, turned myself into the marshals in the courthouse. And they put me in a holding cell below the courthouse, probably for 4 or 5 hours in there somewhere. And then went upstairs and I got arraigned.
What's your thoughts, Jeff? Because you're now a sober man going through the steps, and then you are arrested, and there's no other feeling like that than when you are going through that process. What was going through your mind?
It wasn't negative. You know, at that point, I was viewing everything as a consequence of my behavior and a part of my recovery.
Like a next step.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is almost like an inevitable next step.
Yeah, and they treated me with respect and dignity.
Mm-hmm.
I think that most of the court personnel, and certainly the judge, everyone, I project that they looked at me as someone, you know, in the legal profession, but for the grace of God go I kind of thing. And then they sent me home, and where I had to wait 2 more years to get sentenced and then report to prison. And in that 2 years, my ex-wife had kicked me out, and I met a woman in AA. That's not a surprise, probably. It's kind of the way it works.
Right, I've heard that one.
Who I'm married to now, and
so she went through all that with you then.
She went through.
Yeah.
Yep. And I had separated from my wife, and she had separated from her husband, and we clung to one another. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of a beautiful experience in the midst of all of this chaos.
So 2 years is a long time to wait. I mean, I identify with you with that, because I was 3 years of being indicted, and that's a weird way to live also. You know, you were also going through all your steps of recovery, but just living that way, knowing, you know, that it's probably not good as the end result. And so when you finally get to that sentencing, Jeff, are you have an idea what you're going to be looking at as far as your plea goes? And sentencing?
I think my guideline range was like 21 to 27 months. Mm-hmm. But for the fact that it was a 9/11 disaster loan, I might have had a shot at probation, non-custodial. But there was no way in that climate that they were going to do that.
Make an example out of that.
Yeah, for sure. And I was the third person sentenced in the Southern District for a disaster loan fraud. And you know, it's really remarkable, because it's been it's been 17 or 18 years.
It's been a while. Yeah.
Most of the time I've told the story, nobody was interested in the SBA disaster loan aspect of it. It just wasn't sexy. Nobody could relate.
Yeah.
Now the pandemic's come
A
along, and of course,
whole
it's like
different,
everybody
exactly.
relates.
Yeah, the PPP
Everybody,
and all that
oh,
stuff.
you
Yeah,
know.
exactly.
In fact, I wrote an article for Entrepreneur at the very beginning of the pandemic, and it was called "I Went to Prison for SBA Loan Fraud: 7 Things to Know When You're Taking Disaster Loan Money," and it was the 4th most viewed article in
Wow, on
Entrepreneur
Entrepreneur
for the
Magazine.
year,
Wow,
because it was so
current,
you know,
right on top of current.
yeah, it was so relevant. And it's crazy, for all of those years, nobody knew what I was talking about. It was just
over 10 plus years. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an asterisk. Nobody knew, footnote.
Yeah.
So I did get a downward variance, mostly because of the work that I did in AA and recovery, and having been almost 4 years sober at that time.
Yeah.
And I felt that the sentence was warranted. I didn't, I wasn't offended by having given an 18-month sentence. I was prepared, and I thought it was fair. I really did. So what I didn't know was that I would get designated to a low instead of a camp, and that was just happenstance. That was just no beds available in the camp on the day I was designated.
Yeah, no, I've heard that before, and that's because you don't think that that's the way it is. And I know one of the things that you do now is really help walk people through those type of things, because attorneys don't really know, once that person pleads guilty, they have no idea what happens after that and how you survive that. But I was at Leavenworth, and I think it was like in 85 or 90, they were trying to get designated as a low. And so they created it as a low. They put the fencing up and the barbed wire and the Sally port and everything. And then they didn't designate it. So we were living at Leavenworth as a low, but it was a camp. Now you could go in and out because it was a camp to your work assignments or whatever beyond the fence, but it had, I think there's only like 3 camps that have fences and the rest of them don't. But I had actually forgotten, Jeff, that you were at a low. Until you said that, I did read that, but I'd forgotten that.
Of course, it was frightening going in, because I had to do a lot of reading quickly on what a low was.
Yeah, it's a lot different.
But
because one of the things we're talking about lows and camps, this is two ex-felons talking about prison camps and lows, but you have designated moves in a low and a medium and a maximum, meaning that on the hour you have like 10 minutes to move, and you have to be in that place or you get stuck in the other place. And that in a lifestyle, that's a big deal. Because I talk to people, my bunkmate for a year had come from a low, and he said, Britt, it's just so different not to have those designated moves like that, because your mind is thinking on the hour, and you don't do that in camp at all.
The controlled movement thing is definitely freaked me out for a while. There were other aspects that were not I really didn't expect, that I had to learn a lot about, that would have been different in the camp. And so, as you said, in the control movement, they open the compound, and then you have 10 minutes to move across from one place to another. But if you get caught in the compound while when they lock it up, they'll send you to the SHU.
Right.
Or they'll send you to the head lieutenant's office, and then it's his choice whether or not
he'll send you to the SHU. Right.
Yeah, it kind of depends upon the circumstances. Not everybody who's caught in the compound goes to the SHU.
Yeah.
But it's a nuance I really didn't want to know anything about.
Right.
And
because your sentence definitely applied you to camp. I mean, really, people that are doing 10 plus or 10 less years are camp eligible, but as points.
On the white collar support group last night, the one that you joined in, one of the we had 3 new people come on last night. And we've had 700 participants, and typically there's anywhere from 1 to 3 new people every week,
Hmm.
and maybe somewhere between 25 and 40 people on the Zoom call every week.
Right.
But so often you'll hear someone say, as someone did say last night, they'll say, going to prison was the best thing that could have happened to me. It was the greatest thing that ever happened to me.
Hmm.
And and I think that that's probably revisionist thinking,
Hmm.
that it might be something that I needed. And within the
Right.
theme of this show, the thing that I was most afraid of turned out to be the best thing for me.
Yeah.
But I think that if anybody thinks about it hard enough to think that going to prison is the best thing that ever happened to you, they're in some way what they're deceiving themselves.
Right.
Needed a correction for sure.
Right. You won't ever hear me say that come out of my mouth, Jeff.
But
And I understand some people that their life changes and they gather, I've had, so many different people on, while they're in the hole and they're, they become somebody and take a different path. But man, it's a big statement.
yeah, but I get it, because in a way people want to reduce these things down. It's hard to do.
Hard to make it black and white.
Well, it's hard to do the amount of work it really takes to go through this kind of a transformative experience. And in my case, as I'll just kind of like leave the prison story behind, because my inside prison story wasn't that unique, other than the fact that
I do want to say that how did you, because you have to have strategies when you go into prison. How did you tackle prison? Like how I know you walked a lot. You walked 3,500 miles, and I totally identify with that. I probably did 6 to 8 miles a day. How did you live your life in prison?
I had a very simple philosophy or game plan going in, and was that I knew I would be there for about a year, roughly, and I wanted to accomplish one great thing for mind, body, and spirit during that year. And I wasn't quite sure exactly what that was, but once I had the goal set, that I knew I had to divide it up into little pieces. And so every day I would have to focus on something for my mind, something for my body, and something for my spirit. And so for
great strategy, by the way. I mean, I think you just gave a big tip there for not just people in prison, but trying to live your life. Yeah.
Yeah. Or baking a cake. It's pretty much the same no matter what. You gotta have the ingredients.
You gotta organize yourself.
Yeah. So for my mind, I took guitar lessons. And I took theory, I took guitar. Yeah, I played a little bit of guitar when I was a kid, and I'd been playing continuously a little bit, but I took 200 guitar lessons, and I became a pretty good guitarist. Enough so that I was able to play in the church band when I got out and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And that made the time go fast.
I'm sure it did.
And then for my spirit, I got, kind of thrown into religion, into God. And I kind of really started to explore that. Certainly it was the seeds of what my decisions were a little bit later. And for my body, mostly I decided what I was going to do is I was going to walk the track. And I had made a decision I wasn't going to get into anything that where I could get hurt. I wasn't going to play.
Yeah, you don't want to get hurt in prison. There's a lot of guys, playing softball and that, and they break ankles and wrists and
But walking seemed right. And I just kind of did the math, and I thought if I walked 10 miles a day times for a year, that's roughly the same distance as walking from New York to Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And so what I did was I went into the library, the prison library, and I got a road atlas, I actually charted
I like
the
that.
path.
As you were walking.
And,
I love that.
and then every day where I would see is where 10 miles would take me or as close to it. Because, you know, you
Yeah.
had to flip the pages to get to each state and
Yeah.
everything. And I would learn about as much as I could from that location about where I was vicariously. And it was fascinating because I
No, it's a
walked.
great escape for the mind. I love
Oh, I
that.
walked to Akron, Ohio, and then down
Yeah.
to Nashville, Tennessee, and then across to Memphis, and then Little Rock. And I
Yeah.
mean, I had a path, you know, I had a path. And while I was walking on the track, people would join me.
Mhm.
And they would say, like, what are you doing today? I said, well, I'm in the middle of my walk from Nashville to Memphis. And it was just something, you know, it was just something that
Well, and
that
I
worked.
think, you know, it's interesting for so many different reasons, Jeff, because you have to trick your mind when you're in prison. You have to
Yeah.
have your own escape when you're in prison, because where you are is very dull. There's no colors. You know, you have to create a world around you that hopefully makes you feel more real of who you are, so you don't lose yourself in that environment.
Yeah. And it just became something, all these things I did every single day. And you know, in prison that the days, you know, the days just fly by. And this is how they flew by for me.
Mm-hmm.
When I lost 65 pounds because I had bulked up before I went to prison.
Yeah.
I was in the best shape I'd been in a long time. I could actually run 5K.
Yeah.
That lasted for about a week after I got out of prison, maybe a week.
Everybody's in the best shape they've ever been. Well, not everybody. A lot of people are, and then they look different a little afterwards. But as you get close to the door and you know your freedom's on the other side, what are you thinking? What, like, I'm heading out. What am I doing?
Yeah.
Because I know you did a lot. So, I mean, are you thinking about that behind the fence, or are you just thinking freedom?
No, not so much, because I knew I was going to a halfway house and I didn't know what that was going to mean. And I was going to live with a friend on home confinement for a while.
Yeah.
Home confinement back then, not CARES Act type of home confinement. And so there were a lot of logistics, and
Mm-hmm.
I was certainly overthinking every one of them. But I got through the halfway house and then home confinement. And I had court-ordered drug and alcohol counseling. I wasn't in prison long enough to get into RDAP.
Do RDAP, yeah.
No, but I did have to do the non-residential program.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually learned a lot. You know, I learned a lot about the physiology and psychology and all of that. You know, even in AA, you know, it's not like it's not about education as much as it is support.
Right.
So while I was in drug and alcohol counseling, my counselor said to me, "So, you know, what's your plan? What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to go to AA and I'm going to have sponsor and sponsees and I'm going to do my thing." And he said to me, maybe you want to do some things that you can put on a resume.
Mm. This is your counselor says that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And it just clicked. I said, yeah, well, you know, this AA is great, but I'm probably going to have to make a living.
Mm-hmm.
And I was lucky that the government had not taken away all of my money.
Mm-hmm.
So I had kind of a plan that was going to work for a while. But so I went to my rehab, Silver Hill, and I told them I could volunteer there, and I told them my story, and it didn't shock them, but they still had to do a background check. And but they did it, and 2 hours later they called me and they welcomed me as a volunteer. And from there I went to another place and volunteered, and then I went to a reentry nonprofit in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and that was.
How'd that make you feel, Jeff? I'm sure. I mean, I'm thinking that those type of things that you did the way that you did them at the time that you did them had to really filled you up.
Oh yeah, there was no question. I knew. I even knew from my days in AA that I was turning my life over to service, into the care of God, higher power kind of thing. But I didn't really, it was hard to equate that with, a vocation. Like, what was I going to actually? But I was feeling great about it, and so in the midst of it, I actually went to the pastor in the church that I was attending with my wife. I was talking to her about it, and he said to me, I think you should go to seminary. And that was a little weird, because first I was joking.
How did you react to that?
I didn't even know what seminary was.
Yeah.
I didn't really know what it was. But it turns out a progressive seminary is mostly about a lot about social, maybe not mostly, but a lot about social justice.
Social justice, yeah.
And I applied to Union Theological Seminary in Manhattan, and I was accepted. And I did that for 3 years, full time. Commuted.
What was that like, Jeff, for you? I mean, you're not that far away from your time in prison. You're not that far away from all the other things you're doing. What did that 3 years feel like to you?
Well, first, it was 27 years since I graduated law school, so I didn't even know how to read. Right. And reading these books by theologians and philosophers.
Yeah, heavy. Yeah.
And I also didn't want to be known as the prison guy.
Yeah.
So for the first year and a half, I hid that part. But because of it, I really wasn't having an authentic experience. I didn't know if it was right for me. And I wound up talking to a third-year student about it. And I said to him, I don't think I'm getting a lot out of this. And he said to me, well, instead of trying to get something out of it, maybe what you want to do is try to put something into it. And of course, that was a lesson I'd learned in AA many times, but I just couldn't, I just couldn't translate that. I couldn't transfer that to my seminary experience until that moment. And with that, I just let my guard down, and I started being of service within the seminary, and I ran the prison and religion panels and did all kinds of things like that, and it turned everything around.
Very liberating, yeah.
Oh, it was fantastic. And then, and I was going to AA in the city, not far from up in the morning. It was up at the Columbia campus, so I was doing real New York City brand AA at the time, and that was just a gift. And so when I came out, I applied for a job at a church in the hood in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I knew the pastor because I had been on a nonprofit there. That was the first nonprofit that had invited me to be on their board of directors. And so I got the job as being an associate pastor and director of prison ministries for this inner city church. And it was all Latino and all people of color. Yeah. And my soon-to-be wife, were we married yet? Yeah, we were married. We were married by that point.
We got it.
We were married by that point. We were the only white people there. Yeah. But it was a brand of religion and spirituality that I never really knew about. And it was so beautiful. And I think in the world of privilege, we just often don't really understand what real privilege is, what real success is, or real and the move from a material way of life to a spiritual way of life was in my midst. There was no way to deny that something was going on there. So I was I had a blog I was writing at night, like early days of blogs. And I was writing a blog.
Blogs were like podcasts, really, if you think about it.
Yeah. For those of you listening, a blog is a pre-podcast.
Exactly.
And but I was blogging at night, about the differences about living in Greenwich, but working in Bridgeport, because
Hmm.
in the
The
whole
two
country,
worlds.
yeah,
Yeah.
those are the two most socioeconomically disparate um, communities, same county communities in the country. They're only a
Hmm.
few miles from each other. And I was writing about it, and I got a phone call from a reporter at a hedge fund magazine. And he said to me, he asked me, are you the minister to hedge funders? Because I've been working with all these hedge funders in AA in Greenwich. And I said, no, but as soon as it came out of his mouth, I knew that that was my call.
Calling.
That was my
Yeah.
calling. It was right there. And so soon after, my wife and I started, literally the first ministry in the world devoted to people navigating the white collar justice system.
I just think it's, you so many different things happen in people's lives, and then some people take that and create something that can mean so much. And the fact that you were able to find this path, Jeff, after everything that you'd been through, and you're totally, absolutely 100% qualified for every single thing that someone would come to you for. And that's such a big deal, because
Yeah.
you could tell on the call last night that there are people who desperately are just looking for information. They're getting ready to go in. It's
Yeah.
the most fearful thing in their life that they know. And I do always tell people that nothing is as bad as your mind makes it out to be, not even prison, because what you build up in your mind is. But having someone like you, with your background and your intellect and your ability to tell them and help them, man, it's a really big deal. And I I I think your ability to create that world, and then you were able to get your law license back. Which, what did that feel like for you? Because that had to have been like a full cycle, and now you're kind of a different type of person doing different types of things, and then here's this law license that I used to have.
You think.
Yeah.
The decision to get my law license back was definitely an outgrowth of the ministry and the decision. Mostly, I looked at what people needed,
Yeah.
and what they needed was people to trust,
Hmm.
because the whole system is designed to just take everything that you've got.
Yep.
Not just money either. Your humanity,
Yeah.
your everything, and
Very
and
humbling.
and I'm sorry, my and just to take people who've been treated like roadkill
Hmm.
and try to bring the humanity in and give them someone to trust. And I knew that there was a hole in the market. There's just a lot of good criminal lawyers out there, a
Hmm.
lot, but their job is to get people the shortest sentence they can. I mean, basically,
Right.
that's their job. But there's so many other things that are going on when people are prosecuted. There's civil things and family things and emotional things. And I've been able to deal with a lot of the family and emotional ones, but people's legal issues that they're very concerned about, maybe as much as their criminal case,
Sure.
bankruptcies and partnership dissolutions and winding down and divorces, and maybe
Yeah.
they're so many complicated things. And that's kind of what I had been an expert in my whole life, is just all of those, seeing the big picture and helping sophisticated people put that all together. And I'm thinking, wait a second, there's nobody who does this.
That's what's so great about it, Jeff, is that you were able to recognize that nobody's doing that. Why don't I fill this role?
And so it wasn't as if I did no market research at all, because I did.
Hmm.
And I went to some criminal lawyers who I trusted and I respected. And I said to them, you're in big firms, you're in big law firms. Why aren't you providing these resources. Now they do for their corporate clients, obviously.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
but for the individuals and small companies, and they didn't quite say this, but what I gleaned was that once the process, the criminal process, once it takes all of the resources from somebody who's going to go to prison, basically it takes all their money.
Right.
There's nothing left to take care of all of the other stuff. And so none of the firms want to get involved in that.
Right.
So,
well, and Jeff, you got some unfamiliarity too that goes along with it. Some of the things you're talking about with civil and bankruptcy and those things, there's a legal aspect of that. But once that attorney walks you in and you're sentenced, you are taking two different paths now. You are on a path that no real attorney that does criminal defense work really, and he's heard about it, but never experienced it. And there's a big difference of dealing with somebody who's walked actually through that gate in that world, lived those steps, that can really give somebody a different feeling about how they're going to approach that life and how they're going to survive. That's a real big difference.
No, that's right. But and even in the legal context, even within the legal arena, the context of understanding how all of these decisions affects everything else.
Smooths all that out. Yes.
Because that, as much as well as any of us know, that from the day that you are arrested, life becomes a workaround.
Yeah.
There's no way to accomplish what you might want to accomplish without the specter of that problem being right in front of you.
It's right there with you the whole time. Yeah.
But now I've spent 15 or 16 years helping people work their way around those problems. And the problems are not necessarily what they think they are or what they fear they are. Again, within the context of your show. But for most people, the biggest barriers are themselves.
Sure.
But also within the actual transactions of what they're trying to accomplish, there's usually ways to accomplish things. They just can't do it on their own.
Right.
And
they need help.
They need help.
Yeah.
And so here I am now, having done this basically for 40 years of my life, and just focusing on people in crisis. I was always focused on people in crisis. There was always a crisis.
I mean, you just switched gears to the niche of these people that are in crisis, which is wonderful because you bring all that to the table.
And I would say that the big difference for me personally, I mean, I recognize that it's a huge relief to the clients because they've found someone who understands and can really help them. And I understand that. But for me, the big difference is that I'm not focused on the money anymore.
Yeah.
That's a weird deal. I was afraid when I got my law license back that somehow I was going to become contaminated or I was going to become.
Sure. Because I mean, you would associate that with your old life of when you were, a power player in the legal world. And not that you're not a power player, you're a power player in a different world. And that's the world that's really helping all these people, and you're gathering that journey of your experience.
Well, and so, I mean, what a gift, to treat people fairly and to be expected to be treated fairly in return, as opposed to what I was doing was trying to get over on somebody.
Sure.
Even if that was for a living.
Yeah.
And now to have,
well, you're just truly giving back, Jeff. I mean, it's very rarely I wanted to read this quote because very rarely are you interviewed by someone and the reporter actually gives you a quote back and it said, Jeff Grant is the real deal. He's candid and generous with his wisdom. I can't imagine there is a lawyer in this country more qualified to consider the complex issues facing people prosecuted for white collar crimes in their families. Evan is the reporter from the New Yorker, which, by the way, if you've got a time to go to Jeff's website, you can pull the New Yorker article, which is just a fascinating article about Jeff's journey and what he's doing now. But speaking of journeys, Jeff, I find you such a fascinating individual just because you have done so many different things, and it hasn't been easy. The road has not been a straight line. But of your journey, what do you think is your biggest takeaway from everything that you've experienced?
I think there's probably three things, okay, that other than mission statement of your program, which is like spot on, by the way, you know, that because the thing I feared the most did turn out to be the best for me. But I would say that one, by far the greatest accomplishment in my life was becoming sober.
Yeah.
And without that, nothing good could have happened. So
it's a lot of willpower.
Yeah. So if there's anyone listening to my three things, I'm going to tell you, one, sobriety rocks.
Okay, that's a good one.
and I know it's hard. It's the hardest thing in the world, but
yeah.
But if you if you can do whatever you can do to get into acceptance, and there's a whole new world and a whole new life out there. So that's one. Two is the person you marry is the most important decision of your life. I didn't do this alone. I could not have done it without my wife and partner, Lynn. We are a team, and more than anything, she calls me on my shit. And,
which is great.
And I'm no longer ignoring what's in our best interests in order to people please, or at least not much.
Right. That's liberating in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The codependence thing, we worked our way through it mostly, but we we're that was to be say. I would say number two is who you marry is critical. And the third thing is, and this is the thing that I can't believe in kindergarten that you don't learn this: live within your means.
Yeah.
It's the fact that I now live within my means that I can make any decision I want. I don't have to do anything. And and as I was keeping up with the Joneses and climbing that ladder, and I had this
obligations,
and I had this psychotic thinking that somehow if I got bigger, it would solve my problems, as opposed to if I got simpler, it would solve my problems.
That's so true.
I don't know where that came from, but
that's a speech all in itself.
Well, maybe it's because I'm in my 60s now, and just life changes.
Yeah.
But
good advice.
We live a simple life, and that doesn't mean it's an unprivileged life, because a lot of privileges has come back, especially since I'm a lawyer again, and I'm accepted into circles that I wasn't necessarily invited into even a few years ago.
Yeah.
So I'll
they're earned though. They're earned though. Yeah, Jeff.
I'll tell you a quick story, because I can really divide my professional life and the ministry life, by the way, into two things: before the New Yorker article and after the New Yorker article.
Okay.
Because power of the
New Yorker article was out in 2021, maybe
August 30th of 21. So a little less than 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So I got my law license back, and very soon thereafter, Evan Osnos called about the article, and we did the article fast track that summer. And that fall, we were coming out of the pandemic, and I had joined the American Bar Association again, and they had their white collar conference in Miami. And I decided I'm gonna go to this conference as a lawyer.
Yes.
Right. And I was scared to death. I can't even tell you how much I thought. I didn't know what to expect. I knew it was all in my head, but nobody cared. Nobody knew who I was. But in my mind, I was building it up to something that was frightening.
Yeah.
So I went, and they had a committee there that's called the White Collar Committee, which I had signed up for online. And again, I knew nothing about any of this. So the committee is meeting, and there's probably 30 people sitting in a room, and we're all sitting like in a circle. And the chairperson of the committee, who's a very well-known white collar lawyer, says, well, why don't we each go around the room and we'll state our names and where we're from. So one by one, people are going around and they're saying, my name is so-and-so, I'm from Skadden Arps, I'm from so-and-so, I'm from Sherman and Sterling. And they're talking about, oh, they're from all these big law firms. And it finally gets to me. And I say, I'm Jeff Grant, and I spent 14 months in prison for a white collar crime.
Love it.
Right? Because I thought that was
I love it.
I didn't know what to say. I thought that, and with that, the chairman of the meeting stood up, pointed right at me and said, "You're the guy from the New Yorker." And that was it. It was like, now I'm the guy from the New Yorker.
Yeah.
And I've been to many white collar conferences and things, and it's amazing that there hasn't been one person I've met who has been dismissive, not one person who hasn't been accepting, hasn't treated me like a peer. You know, it was really.
Yeah, I got to tell you, Jeff, I think there's something to that. You're very vulnerable. You don't cut any corners about your story and how you got through things. And I think people really identify with those type of things. You're not defensive. You're just real. And whether you would have gotten in the New Yorker or not, you earned your way into people believing in you and trusting you to help them. And so there's a story there all in itself of how you handle a crisis and who you are through the crisis and how people react to you, for sure.
Well, that's beautiful. Thank you for saying that, Brent. I know that you were able to see a little bit of that last night, and
yes,
that was a gift having you there. So thank you.
And I love the fact that I was able to do that before we interviewed today, because it gave me a real insight to what's going on and the power of it. But Jeff, man, thanks so much for being here and a guest. And I think the listeners are going to get so much out of this. And by the way, if you get something out of this, if just one person gets something out, share it. It's a big deal. And if you guys have time, I know it's kind of a hassle, but leave a review on Apple or on Spotify. It's real easy to do. All you got to do is just scroll down the page. It says write a review, click on it. It somehow puts the show on steroids every time we get the reviews and helps promote the show. Anybody wants to get a hold of me, BrentCassidy.com. Remember, I spell Cassidy wrong. It's not like Sean and David. It's with an ITY. But yes, follow the show. It'll give you the notifications when we get going. As I used to say to my people when I was typing back and forth from Leavenworth, stay strong, and I'll do the same. Nightmare Success in and out. Jeff, Grant, thanks so much for being and sharing your story.
Brent, thank you for having a really beautiful experience. Thank you.
Nightmare Success in and out. See y'all.